Hello and welcome to the next instalment of the Taking a Ride. This is part 6, as you can see by the title. I'm on the road back into Goulburn on the Windella Road, going through the back towards Goulburn and then around the town a little bit. And I'll let you enjoy the scenery and the road and look at the sky and all those sort of things while I talk about the subject that I've chosen for today. I don't have any pop culture reference from Chuck Berry or George Harrison this time, so I'll just launch directly into what it is that I wanted to talk about. And I'm going to talk about the car market, but before I get into cars, I'm going to talk a little bit about the motorcycle market. And I'm going to start by saying that there was a time when motorcycles first became, or that I can remember, that motorcycles were popular in Australia in the late 50s and early 60s, when the motorcycles that you saw were all British brands. They were Triumph, BSA, Royal Enfield, and so forth. So there were some American motorcycles, I guess, available, Harley Davidson and Indian perhaps, but I don't recall seeing very many of those. I recall seeing lots of Triumphs, some BSAs and some Royal Enfields. And then at a point, I don't know exactly when this happened, but at a point there started to appear Japanese motorcycles. The Japanese had begun to rebuild their economy after the end of World War II, and they began making scooters and then motorcycles. And before long, Honda, Yamaha, Suzuki and Kawasaki were all making and exporting motorcycles to Australia. And it's probably true that when they first came into the Australian market, some of the bikes they made weren't very good. But before long, the predominant brands were those four Japanese makers, and the British motorcycles went by the wayside. And in fact, I think the British motorcycle industry virtually ceased to exist. Royal Enfield is now owned by a company in India. BSA, to the best of my knowledge, no longer exists, and Triumph motorcycles are made, but as far as I know, they're made by an American company. And that was because I guess that eventually the Japanese got their act together and were able to build a good quality motorcycle at an affordable price that people were willing to buy and willing to ride. Now, I know that by the time I was at Teachers College in about 1971-72, I had a Honda CB250 at one stage, and it was a very well made, very good quality motorcycle that I thoroughly enjoyed. Now, the point I'm making here is that the Japanese got their act together and market tastes changed, and some manufacturers that had been strong in the market dwindled and then disappeared, and the Japanese became very strong. Now, if we look at the Australian car market, prior to the creation of Holden as a vehicle manufacturer, I guess most cars that came in, all the cars that came into Australia were either American or British brands. I can remember in my younger days seeing Hillmans, Anglias, Vauxhalls, Vanguards, Zephyrs, Bedfords, Austins, Morrises, and a variety of American brands that I can't name as well, but I know that at one stage, for example, there were Ramblers and Studebakers also in Australia. Now, over time, for a variety of reasons, some of those brands ceased to be seen in the Australian market. The creation of Holden as a motor vehicle manufacturer with government subsidy meant that there was an actual Australian car that people would buy, and started off buying those cars in big numbers. And then in the early 60s, I think, Ford also opened a factory here, and before long, Chrysler had a factory here, and so we had Holden, Ford and Chrysler, which were sold here under the brand name Valiant. They were all considered to be Australian cars and all made here. And then at various points we've had Datsun Nissan, who made cars here. We had Mitsubishi, who took over the old Chrysler factory or Valiant factory when it ceased to exist, and Toyota, who all made cars in Australia. Now, in about the early 60s, I'm going to say, Japanese cars, again, like motorcycles, began to appear on the Australian market. When they first came here, nobody would buy them. People wouldn't buy Japanese cars because made in Japan was synonymous with poor quality, and also there was the hangover from the events of World War II that Australians who had been involved in World War II hadn't gotten over, and fair enough, and they just wouldn't buy Japanese cars. But at some point, the Japanese decided to get their act together, and began to produce quality cars, and people started to buy those cars. Toyota and Mazda were big selling brands, and Mitsubishi was also another big selling brand, and Japanese brands became the predominant brand in Australia. Now, at some point in about 2014 or 15, I'm not exactly sure, can't remember the date exactly, but the government of Prime Minister Tony Abbott and Treasurer Joe Hockey decided that the Australian government would no longer subsidise Ford, Holden and Toyota to make cars in Australia. The government was actually paying those companies, like many other governments do, to make cars in Australia because the car industry was thought to be very important in terms of the flow-on effects from various other component manufacturers, but also in terms of its employment. But the Australian government decided they would no longer do that, and within a short space of time, General Motors, Ford and then Toyota all closed their factories and left Australia. Toyota could have continued to manufacture cars in Australia because they were making the Camry Hybrid, which was being exported around the world for use as a taxi, but the other two companies, their parent companies, forbid the Australian manufacturers to export their cars, and so their only market was here in Australia, with the Ford Falcon and the Commodore being the biggest of their brands, and people simply were not buying those cars any longer. Holden and Ford were continuing to make these big sedans when the market had changed to hatchbacks and SUVs and so on, and people were just not buying Commodores or Falcons any longer, and so the companies closed their shop and went out of business. As a consequence, Toyota and Mazda are the biggest selling brands in Australia, and the next two biggest selling brands are, I think, Hyundai and Kia. Now, following this cycle of brands coming and going and so on, at the same time, I can think of American brands like, as I might have said this earlier, Rambler, Studebaker, sorry, I had a mental block there for a moment, Studebaker, Duesenberg and DeLorean, to name four that used to be manufactured, not in Australia, but were brands that used to be made that no longer exist. Rambler and Studebaker. Rambler were made by a company called American Motors. It just went bankrupt. I'm not sure what happened to Studebaker. We know what happened to DeLorean. I ended up going in Back to the Future, and Duesenberg, I guess they just stopped making them. So there were cars that come and cars that go. And at various times there have been European manufacturers that have come into the Australian market for a period of time and then gone. For example, Opel have been here several times. The last time they came here was maybe a decade ago, and they were here for about a year, and then they stopped exporting cars to Australia, which means the people who had bought them were left with cars that nobody wanted and at parts that they couldn't get. Now, there's a point to all this, and that is that following the surge in Japanese sales, and Japanese makers becoming the predominant manufacturers and makers in Australia, and Toyota being the biggest car manufacturer in the world, at some point in the late 80s or early 90s, Korean manufacturers started to export and sell cars in Australia. And at one stage we had 4 Korean brands being sold in Australia, those being Hyundai and Kia, which are two companies that are part of the same big parent company. Daewoo, which eventually became part of GM and no longer sells cars in Australia, and SsangYong, which I think has experienced some financial difficulties recently and no longer sells cars in Australia, but I'm not 100% certain about that. What I am certain is that people now buy Hyundai and Kia in big numbers, and that Kia have won several Car of the Year awards, and that both of those companies have good reputations for after-sales service. Now, I'm not telling you this to try and spruik either brand or suggest you buy either brand. It's all about trends in the market that I want to talk about, rather than any particular brand. But the point is, there were British and American brands. The Japanese came in and took over the market from them, and then the Koreans came in and did to the Japanese exactly what the Japanese had done to the British and American brands. And now there are a lot of people who are getting themselves in a big tiz and in a big state about Chinese manufacturers. And I know in a previous couple of videos I talked about some Chinese brands that are already here, those brands being BYD, which is an exclusively electric brand, Aura, which I believe is an electric branch of Great Wall Motors, and MG, which seem to have a foot in every camp because they have petrol engine cars, they have plug-in hybrid cars, and they also have electric cars. Now, on top of that, there are also, of course, Teslas that are made in China, and Polestar, which are also made in China and are the electric arm of Volvo. But along with that, we have at the moment Haval, manufacturer, which I think is part of the Great Wall brand, and we have Chery. And Chery are coming back into the Australian market after an absence of, I think, 5 or 6 years. And in particular, one of their models that's coming to Australia recently and been tested by a lot of people is the Emoda 5. Now, as I said, I'm not here to tell you to buy any of these brands. I'm not spruiking any of them. I'm just saying that they are here in the market. And in the same way as when the Japanese first came and when the Koreans first came, some of their cars are good and some are not so good. The MG electric car, for example, is being touted as the first really affordable electric car. The Aura Funky Cat, as it's known somewhere, but I think it's just called the Aura here, is also being talked about quite well as a urban electric car, and the BYD Atto 3 is getting some very glowing reviews. The Chery Emoda 5, on the other hand, is getting some reviews that say it looks good, it's well made, the cabin's comfortable, the style is nice and so on, but the driving experience isn't so good. And there are complaints about the Chinese government subsidising its manufacturers so that they can sell cars at a cheaper price than anybody else. As I said, the Australian government did that with Holden. When Holden first were established, they did it with Ford and Toyota at one stage as well, in order to keep people in employment and keep jobs in Australia and keep factories open, and also all those component manufacturers that are part of the motor vehicle. So the Chinese aren't doing anything that hasn't been done by anybody else. And if you remember, during the GFC, the American government bailed out General Motors and Ford. So what the Chinese are doing is not new and not necessarily, might not be right, but it's not different from what any other government has done in regard to keeping its motor vehicle manufacturing industry going. Now, as I said, the Chery Emoda 5 is being talked about as looking nice, being well made, looking comfortable, but not necessarily the greatest driving experience. And perhaps there are some things that that company needs to do with that car before it will get better reports. But the MG Excite 51 has got some good reviews, the Aura has got some very good reviews, and the BYD has got some very good reviews as well. So the point I'm making here is that the Japanese did a thing that resulted in the demise of the British motor car making industry, along with poor government policies and industrial relations policies in Britain, added to the demise. But the Japanese learned how to make a good quality car at a lower price that people wanted to buy. The Koreans came in and said, well, that's what the Chinese did. That's what the Japanese did. That's what we have to do. And they learned how to make a good quality car at an affordable price that people would want to buy. And whilst the CEO of Volkswagen once said sneeringly, no one aspires to a Hyundai, and that may be true, the fact is people buy Hyundais in big numbers, and they buy them in big numbers because they're affordable, they're reliable, and they have good after-sales service. And it appears that now the Chinese have done the same thing and said, well, this is what the Japanese did, this is what the Koreans have did. If we want to be successful in making cars, we can make hundreds of them, millions of them. I believe that makes the combined output of all Chinese vehicle manufacturers something like 28 million cars a year. So they're making plenty of cars, but if they want to sell them outside of China, they need to make affordable cars that people will want to buy. And that means that the quality has to be there. And it appears that they are learning that lesson, and they're getting designers and people like that in to make sure that the car looks like people want to buy it. It looks like it wants to be in people's garage, and it looks good when you sit in it, and it drives well and is economical to own and run and all those sort of things. So what is happening in regard to Chinese manufacturers at the moment is something that I've said in comments and various other YouTube videos about cars was inevitable. Once the Chinese get the quality control right, once they get the after-sales service right and the parts and supply and the training of technicians correct, they will just swamp everybody else, because they will produce cars at an affordable price that are good quality that people want to buy. And that's what car companies are in business for, isn't it? And in the case of BYD and Aura, they've already decided, well, the electric car market is where we need to be, because that's the way of the future. And again, I'm not here to say buy an electric car or not buy one. I'm just saying what I am observing in the market. And so these Chinese manufacturers said, well, this is where the market's going. We need to get in front of this. And in about 2010, they made a conscious decision to invest in the production of electric cars, and that's why we're seeing these cars appear on our market now. All right, well, that's about all I wanted to say to you about electric cars, or about cars for the moment. So I'll say goodbye. Thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed my commentary and enjoyed the scenery, and I will talk to you when I'm making the next video. So thank you very much for watching. Please provide any comments in the feedback.